What's up, guys? Welcome to another exciting episode of my YouTube UB Icon, and today I'll be taking you guys on the basic camera setup for beginner photography. As we all know, it's a new year, 2022, and most people are actually shifting passions or shifting careers. Most people are actually bought a camera and want to go into the business of photography, and basically they don't have the knowledge about operating their gadgets that they just bought. So I'm here with this piece of video to actually help you know the basic camera setup for beginner photography. You can take those good pictures outside, anywhere, indoor or outdoor, even with friends. As long as you understand this basic setup, you're good to go with your photography business. In order to take good pictures of your camera you just bought, getting into the photography business as a beginner photographer, you need to understand what they call the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle is built up of three parts inside the camera body. In these three parts, it's namely as the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. So I'm going to talk about each and every one of these parts differently as we go from the ISO right now. So I'm going to explain the ISO to you. The ISO is the camera sensitivity to light. So you have to understand that the higher the number of the ISO goes up, the more light you get inside the camera, outside the pictures you're taking. And this also affects the quality of the picture, because the higher the number, the more grainy or more noise the picture becomes. So it depends on shooting in different areas and location. So if you're actually shooting outdoor, I'd advise you to actually leave your ISO at a 100, or if the environment is quite shady or cloudy, you should take it up to 200 with the balancing of the other two parts of the exposure triangle. So most times the ISO is one of the reasons cameras are actually expensive or fluctuate in price nowadays in the market. So for lower cameras, we have an ISO that goes from 100 up to 1600 or 1000. But for more expensive cameras, we have ISO that surpasses the 1600 phase down to 3200, 6400, 2500, and as the number goes. So for general photography, it's best to pay more to get more light. So in order to understand the ISO very well, it's good for you to actually leave it at a minimal level whenever you're shooting at a particular location. And when you're shooting indoors, taking indoor photographs, you need to understand that your ISO needs to be from a 400 to a 800 in order not to get more grains with the other balancing factors of the two exposure triangles I mentioned earlier. The higher the number of the ISO, the more light you gain inside the image, and the more grain you control or let in into the image. So it's good for you to understand this part. Next up is the aperture. The aperture is a functionality in the camera that controls the amount of light that comes in through the lens to hit the image. The lens is actually a major part that lets light in to actually illuminate the image. So the higher the number of that aperture, the more reduced amount of light comes in to hit the image, and the more lower the number of that aperture is, the more open the lens is to receive image, to illuminate a particular, to receive light rather, to illuminate a particular image you're shooting. So the aperture is represented in f-stop, f1.4, 1.8, up to 2.5, 3.5, 5.6, 4.0, 4.5, all the way up to 13. The aperture controls the depth of field. Depth of field is referred to as how much is in focus in front and behind of what is being focused upon. The depth of field works well, especially when you're taking portrait photographs. Portraits in the sense that you don't have much people or much subjects to actually focus upon, so you're actually focusing on a particular image, thereby breaking down your aperture to a 3.5, 2.8, 2.5, or a 1.8, depending on the scenario, to get more in depth of that picture. But for group photographs, the need to reduce the depth, thereby taking up your aperture to a 5.6, 4.5, 6.0, 7.3, in order to reduce the amount of depth you have on that particular image. So that is how the aperture controls the depth of field. So depth is therefore referred to as more in focus, less in depth. Less in focus, more in depth. Okay, taking a look at this picture now, this is a perfect representation of a depth of field and aperture in control. Looking at the background, this picture was taken at a 4.5 aperture upward here, and you can see the amount of depth we have, leaving only the petals, the flower in focus. This other flower we have here is all in focus, leaving us with a shallow depth. Now, moving up to a 6.3, you can see the amount of depth we have now reducing, making the picture a little bit outspoken, the background a little bit outspoken, seeing clearly most of the things there rather than the previous one we have here. Now moving on to the next one, a 10. Now we can clearly see what we have in our background now because it's taken at a 10 f-stop. Now we have clearly everything in focus, looking at the flower behind and the brown sculpture behind here and the other flower down here. So we have clearly seen the manipulation of an aperture controlling the depth of field, and also 13 here. This is a clear picture of everything in the background, everything is in focus. So we can clearly see how the aperture controls the depth of field in a particular image. Shutter speed is exactly what it sounds like. It's the speed at which a camera closes whenever a camera shot is being taken. A fast shutter speed creates shorter exposure for the photographer, while a slow shutter speed creates long exposure for the photographer. It is the amount of time measured in seconds that the shutter of the camera is open. It is used in freezing motion. The functionalities of a shutter speed on your camera is to actually freeze motion. The lower the number, the more motion you get in your picture. The higher the number, the more freezing motion you get. Anything that involves movement, you can use shutter speed, increase the number up, and you can freeze the motion in movements to actually get a very sharp picture. So the shutter speed controls the motion in pictures. That is what its functionalities is based on. I'm going to show you a representation of a shutter speed with the movement in these leaves, as you can see on this tree hanging here. So you can see it's really airy out here, so we can actually get movement with the air blowing on the leaves. So I'm going to take a few pictures and show you how I freeze the motion and make the pictures come out really outspoken and sharp with the manipulation of the shutter speed, taking it from the lowest number up to the highest number, not really highest, but the number that can actually make these leaves sharp and outspoken. Okay, right here we have a good representation of a shutter speed. As we can see the leaves there on the tree, and we see that there's actually motion, air blowing on that particular atmosphere, and this picture was shot on a shutter speed 10. That is it represented up there, 10, and we can see how the motion has overclouded the picture, the leaves either, and we can actually get a full representation of the leaves. It's not actually outspoken or sharp as we ought. Then this is the next one we took on 20. It is actually coming up because the motion has actually been freezed a little bit. That is it, 20. We took the shutter speed up, so we can see how clear the leaves actually look now on that particular image. Then this is the next 100. It is really outspoken here. We see that it is a clear and sharp image, even with all the air and breeze blowing on it. We actually freeze the motion, getting a perfect picture of those leaves on that tree. So isn't that beautiful? We can actually control or freeze motion with shutter speed. The shutter speed is normally close to the aperture. That is the shutter speed 100, the aperture 5.6. So thank you very much for actually sticking with us. So whenever you're actually shooting, you should look out for your ISO. Try to increase your ISO whenever you're in an indoor environment to 800, 400, or 1600. That should be the maximum level if you're actually shooting with a low camera. But if you're actually shooting up with a 4K full frame camera in an indoor environment, you can actually take your ISO up to 1600 with the other functionalities of the exposure triangle in check. If your pictures are too dark shooting, in an outdoor environment, the first thing you should check is your ISO. Try to take it up to like a 200, and the shutter speed should be reduced as long as you are not getting motion blur in a particular picture. Try to tilt it down a little. That is where you can get better, brighter pictures. And if your pictures are too dark, reverse is the case. I barely touch my aperture because my aperture is what actually gives me beautiful depth in my pictures. And the aperture is the last resort whenever I'm trying to manipulate my exposure to get better, brighter pictures. So as long as you enjoy your new gadget and you welcome to photography, go out there, shoot more, and get more content rolling. The more you shoot, the more learning capabilities you will get, and the more exposure you will get. Thank you, and look out for more content. Don't forget to subscribe to this content, like my video and comment on this, and also follow my Instagram, Director Iconic Productions, and Director Iconic Weddings also, for beautiful wedding content we have been producing over the years, and Director Iconic Productions for events we have been shooting all over my city over the years too, and my personal handle UB Icon for personal updates, and follow me and keep up with my channel. Thank you very much, and see you on the next episode. Bye bye.